A man collapses and dies on stage. The audience doesn't panic. They cheer. They clap. They consume his actual biological death as a theatrical performance. This was the terrifying reality of the Spinners. Behind the glamorous facade of Motown Records was a brutal, unspoken class system. At night, they recorded million-dollar hits. In the morning, they were forced to scrub the studio toilets and pack boxes for $50 a week. How did an industry convince world-class vocalists to accept a life of humiliation as corporate janitors, only to physically destroy them the moment they finally broke free? The tragedy of men with generation-defining talent holding brooms instead of microphones begins with how they entered the building in the first place. The Spinners were not discovered in a glamorous audition. They did not stand in front of Berry Gordy and blow the executives away with a stellar performance, earning a hard-fought recording contract. They were not chosen. They were acquired. In 1963, Motown Records was aggressively expanding its empire, swallowing up smaller local competitors to consolidate power in the Detroit music scene. One of these struggling rival labels was Tri-Fi Records, owned by Harvey Fuqua. Fuqua was a brilliant producer, a former member of the Moonglows, and notably the husband of Gwen Gordy, Berry Gordy's sister. When Motown absorbed Tri-Fi, they were primarily interested in securing Fuqua's production talents and his songwriting catalog. The artists on the Tri-Fi roster were secondary. The Spinners were simply part of the paperwork. They were bundled into the corporate acquisition, along with the office furniture and leftover recording tape. They walked through the doors of Hitsville, not as priority investments with a dedicated marketing budget, but as excess inventory. In an industry entirely built on perception, momentum, and internal politics, starting your tenure as inherited property is a death sentence for your career. They did not fit the pristine, carefully cultivated image of the Motown hit factory, and because they were not built from the ground up by Motown star makers, they were immediately viewed with a quiet, institutional indifference. And this is where the machinery of the music business reveals its coldest gears. Motown was not a family, despite the pervasive public relations narrative that claimed otherwise. It was an industrial complex. Before founding the label, Berry Gordy had worked on the assembly line at the Lincoln Mercury automobile plant. He absorbed the brutal efficiency of that environment and applied the exact same model to human beings. You bring in raw material from the streets, you hammer it into shape in the artist development department, teaching them how to walk, talk, and hold a teacup. You put the music through rigorous quality control meetings on Friday mornings, and then you sell the finished, polished product to the masses. In this factory, the workforce was strictly categorized into a rigid, unspoken class system. At the very top were the Class A artists. These were the names that generated massive revenue, and consequently they received the best songwriters, the most expensive studio time, the prime television appearances on shows like Ed Sullivan, and the full weight of the label's promotional muscle. Beneath them were the Class B artists who received the leftover songs and secondary tour dates, kept on the roster just in case one of their tracks accidentally caught fire on the radio. The Spinners were not Class B, they were barely even Class C. Because they were acquired property and because they had not immediately produced a massive hit record to justify their existence, the Motown machine had to find other, more practical uses for them. The label operated on a system of draws. Artists were given a small weekly stipend, an advance against their future hypothetical royalties. For the spinners, this amounted to roughly $50 a week. To justify this meager payout for artists who were not actively recording hit records, Motown put the group to manual labor. This was the mechanism of class humiliation, and it was deeply systemic. The members of the group, Henry Fambrough, Billy Henderson, Purvis Jackson, Bobby Smith, and Edgar Chico Edwards, were assigned to the shipping department. They spent their days packing heavy boxes of vinyl records, taping them up, and loading them onto trucks. They were packing the hit records of the artists who were actually famous, the artists who had been deemed worthy of the label's attention. They worked as chauffeurs, tasked with driving the Class A stars to the airport or to local television stations. They acted as roadies and stagehands, hauling heavy amplifiers, pulling thick electrical cables, and setting up microphone stands for other groups before shows. And, most degrading of all, they cleaned, they swept the studio floors, they emptied the ashtrays in the recording booths, they scrubbed the bathrooms. The psychological toll of this existence cannot be overstated. It was a daily visceral reminder of their place at the absolute bottom of the hierarchy. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Late at night, they stood in a vocal booth, laying down flawless background harmonies for another artist, knowing with absolute certainty that their voices were world class. Then at 6 a.m, the session ended. They were handed brooms to sweep up the cigarette butts left behind by the very peers they had just sung behind. The system sent a clear, unyielding message. Your musical talent is entirely secondary. Your primary value to this corporation is your obedience and your physical labor. This creates a drama-filled contradiction between how the public perceives the glamorous world of Motown and the grim, sweat-soaked reality of the men trapped in its basement. The public saw a hit factory producing joy and rhythm. The spinners saw a grueling warehouse job that just happened to have recording equipment in the next room. Every tragic figure in history harbors a fatal weakness, a specific psychological flaw that dictates their path and ultimately seals their fate. For the spinners, this hamartia was their misplaced loyalty. The logical question is why a group with such immense, undeniable talent didn't simply walk out the door. Why endure the humiliation of scrubbing toilets for executives who refuse to release your music? The answer lies in the deeply manipulative power of corporate culture. They stayed because they believed the lie. They bought wholeheartedly into the pervasive, carefully constructed myth of the Motown family. The label fostered an environment that blurred the lines between employer and parent. Gordy was a patriarchal figure. The artists were encouraged to view the label not as a business partner, but as a home that had rescued them from poverty. The spinners, the earnest and hard-working men from working-class backgrounds, operated under the assumption that the system was inherently fair. They convinced themselves that if they just worked hard enough, if they carried enough bags without complaint, if they swept enough floors and showed ultimate deference to the executives, their humility would eventually be rewarded. They thought their subservience was a down payment on respect. They believed their sweat equity would eventually buy them a place at the table, a chance to work with the top-tier writers like Holland Dozier Holland or Smokey Robinson. They rationalize the humiliation as merely paying their dues, entirely failing to realize that the industry does not reward quiet obedience with stardom. It rewards leverage, and the spinners had none. They endured this quiet, grinding humiliation for nearly a decade. 10 long years of smiling politely in the hallways, biting their tongues and watching lesser vocalists climb the Billboard charts while they checked the inventory in the stockroom. They released a few singles during this long stretch, songs like I'll Always Love You and Truly Yours. These tracks were minor R&B hits, undeniable proof of their vocal chemistry, but they were never given the financial backing or the promotional push required to cross over to the mainstream pop audience. The label would press the records, send them out, and then immediately return the group to their chores. The gap between what the group intended to become renowned, respected recording artists and what actually happened was vast. They had traded their artistic autonomy for a $50 a week job as corporate servants. Their loyalty was absolute, but it was directed at a machine that was completely incapable of loving them back. They were paralyzed by their own dedication, trapped in a cycle of hope and disappointment, waiting for a promotion that the system had already decided would never come. It was a slow, agonizing erosion of their self-worth, masked by the glittering facade of the most successful Black-owned business in American history. They were shadows in the hit factory, invisible men harmonizing in the dark, waiting for someone, anyone, to turn on the lights. The lights in the hit factory were eventually turned on, but it was not the Motown executives who finally flipped the switch. It was a 20-year-old blind visionary who was already quietly dismantling the label's rigid corporate structure from the inside. By the dawn of 1970, Stevlin Judkins, known globally as Stevie Wonder, was in a state of artistic rebellion. He was no longer the obedient child prodigy the label had cultivated in the 1960s. He was demanding creative control, experimenting with new synthesizers, and writing songs that did not fit the traditional assembly line pop formula. Wonder was producing his own tracks, and he needed specific instruments to execute his vision. He did not view vocalists as royalty. He viewed them as tools in his orchestral arrangement. For a new track he had co-written with Cyrita Wright and Lee Garrett, Wonder required a very specific sound. He bypassed the polished Class A superstars. He walked past the platinum-selling quartets and went directly to the bottom of the roster. He selected the men who were still packing boxes in the shipping department. He chose the spinners. The song was called It's a Shame. The profound irony of this moment lies buried in the lyrical content of the track itself. The song is a desperate, up-tempo plea about a man who is being relentlessly used, manipulated, and strung along by someone he loves, yet he cannot bring himself to leave. It was a perfect, unintentional metaphor for the Spinners' entire existence at Motown. Wonder handed the lead vocal duties to G.C. Cameron. Cameron possessed a voice that was fundamentally different from the smooth, crooning leads the label usually favored. His voice was gritty, urgent, and soaked in the raw emotion of Southern soul. When Cameron sang the opening lines, he was not just performing, he was channeling a decade of suppressed frustration. Behind him, Henry Fambrough, Billy Henderson, Purvis Jackson, and Bobby Smith laid down a flawless, intricate, harmonic bed that proved they had never lost their precision, even while sweeping the floors. The record was released in the summer of 1970. The machinery of American radio took over, and the public responded instantly to the undeniable energy of the track. It's a Shame began to climb the Billboard Hot 100, eventually peaking at number 14. It reached number 4 on the R&B charts. It sold over 1 million copies, becoming a certified, undisputed smash hit. For the Spinners, this was the moment of validation they had spent nearly 10 years waiting for. This was the payoff for their misplaced loyalty. They had played by the rules. They had endured the class humiliation. They had swallowed their pride, done the manual labor, and now, finally, they had delivered the product the factory demanded. They walked into the Hitsville headquarters expecting the invisible walls of the caste system to dissolve. They expected to be pulled from the shipping department and ushered into the executive suites. They anticipated the A-list treatment, the sudden influx of promotional budgets, the headlining national tours, the custom-tailored suits, and most importantly, the respect of their peers. They received absolutely nothing. The issue here is not that Motown's executives were deaf to a hit record. The issue is that the corporate system was fundamentally incapable of rewriting its own internal hierarchy. Berry Gordy and his executive team viewed the massive success of It's a Shame not as a breakthrough, but as a statistical anomaly. It was an accounting error in their favor. To admit that the Spinners were actually A-list material would mean admitting that the label's legendary quality control process had been categorically wrong for almost a decade. It would mean acknowledging that the executives had squandered a massive talent pool by forcing them to clean bathrooms. The Motown machine relied heavily on the absolute infallibility of its leadership. They could not afford to be wrong. Therefore, the system protected its ego by dismissing the group's success as a fluke. They refused to fund a high-profile follow-up album. They refused to book them on the major television circuits. And in the ultimate act of corporate degradation, the weekly $50 draw remained unchanged. The group had just generated millions of dollars in revenue for the corporation, and they were still expected to behave like temporary employees grateful for a handout. This is the exact moment the hamartia shattered. The fatal weakness of misplaced loyalty was suddenly cured by the brutal, undeniable reality of capitalist exploitation. The cognitive dissonance was simply too great to sustain. They could no longer pretend that Motown was a family. It was a factory, and in a factory, a piece of machinery does not get promoted to management just because it operates efficiently. The realization was psychologically devastating. You can endure a tremendous amount of suffering if you believe there is a righteous reward at the end of the road. But when you reach the end of the road and find the door locked from the inside, the loyalty curdles into profound resentment. They realized they had sacrificed their artistic youth to a machine that viewed them as entirely disposable. They had followed every rule, and the rules had been weaponized against them. It took an outsider, someone who intimately understood the mechanics of industry suppression, to finally push them out the door. Aretha Franklin was an undisputed monarch in the music industry, but she was also a Detroit native deeply embedded in the city's musical fabric. She knew the members of the Spinners personally. More importantly, she understood the precise nature of their captivity. Before she became the Queen of Soul at Atlantic Records, Franklin had spent years trapped in a contract at Columbia Records. Columbia had completely misdiagnosed her talent, forcing her to sing polite, sanitized jazz and pop standards, actively suppressing the raw gospel power that would later define her career. She recognized the exact same corporate suffocation happening to the Spinners at Motown. Franklin gave them the most dangerous and necessary advice a Motown artist could receive. She told them to stop waiting for permission to be great. She told them the Motown system would never grant them the status they had earned because keeping them at the bottom was more convenient for the label's internal politics. She advised them to leave the factory immediately and approach Atlantic Records, a label that had a proven track record of respecting and elevating authentic R&B talent. The Spinners made the terrifying decision to defect. They approached Atlantic, and the executives there, specifically led by the visionary producer Tom Bell, saw exactly what Motown willfully ignored. Atlantic saw a veteran vocal group with impeccable harmonies, a massive untapped potential, and the hunger of men who had been starved for a decade. The deal was prepared. The escape route was finally clear. But a capitalist machine does not simply let its inventory walk out the door, especially not inventory that just proved it could generate a top 15 Billboard hit. The moment Motown's executive suite caught wind of the impending defection, the corporate apparatus activated with ruthless efficiency. They did not want to spend the money to promote the Spinners, but they absolutely would not allow a rival corporation to profit from them. If they could not own the group's success, they would ensure no one else could either. They deployed their legal department to audit the group's paperwork, searching for any possible leverage to block the move. They found their weapon in the fine print. When the Spinners were originally acquired from Tri-Fi Records and during subsequent contract renewals, the paperwork had been structured in a way that heavily favored the corporation over the collective. While the group was signed as a single entity, Motown had astutely secured a separate, individual, and ironclad contract with G.C. Cameron. He was the lead voice on It's a Shame. He was the specific asset that had just proven its commercial viability. Motown enforced the contract with surgical cruelty. They issued a legal ultimatum. They informed the rest of the group, Fambro, Henderson, Jackson, and Smith, that their collective contract had expired and they were technically free to leave and sign with Atlantic Records. However, G.C. Cameron remained the exclusive, legally bound property of Motown Records. He could not leave. He could not record for Atlantic. If the group wanted to defect, they would have to amputate their own lead singer to do it. This is the intersection where corporate mechanics intentionally fracture human relationships. The label weaponized the group's loyalty against itself. G.C. Cameron was suddenly thrust into a devastating psychological dilemma. He was fiercely loyal to the men he had harmonized with for years, the men who had suffered the same humiliations in the basement of Hitsville. But he was also an intensely ambitious vocalist who had just tasted the intoxicating rush of mainstream success. Motown executives recognized this ambition and exploited it perfectly. They pulled Cameron into the corporate offices and whispered promises of a massive solo career. They told him that It's a Shame was just the beginning. They assured him that he was the true star, the singular talent holding the group together, and that he did not need to share the spotlight or the royalties with the aging background singers. They used the allure of the very A-list treatment he had always craved, to sever his allegiance to his brothers. The gap between what Cameron intended and what the system demanded was unbridgeable. To stay with his group meant dragging them into a protracted multi-million-dollar legal battle against an industry titan, a battle they could not afford and would inevitably lose, resulting in the entire group being shelved indefinitely. To let them go meant dismantling the vocal chemistry that had finally brought them a hit record. In the end, the legal chains were too strong. Cameron made the agonizing decision to remain at Motown, hoping that the executives would fulfill their promises of solo stardom. The Spinners were forced to walk away from the label, leaving their lead vocalist behind in the factory. The system had successfully extracted the most valuable component and discarded the rest. But Cameron, racked with the guilt of the separation, made one final crucial move to ensure the survival of the men he was leaving behind. He knew intimately that a vocal harmony group, no matter how skilled the background singers are, is entirely unmarketable to a major label without a dynamic, identifiable lead voice. Atlantic Records was expecting the group that sang "It's a Shame," and arriving without Cameron could have killed the deal before the ink was dry. Before the Spinners officially severed ties and headed to Philadelphia to meet with Tom Bell, Cameron reached out to his cousin, a young man who had been scraping by on the fringes of the Detroit music scene. His name was Philippe Wynne. Wynne was the absolute antithesis of the polished, highly regulated product that Motown manufactured. He had never been subjected to the label's charm school. He had not been taught how to smile politely for white television audiences. He was raw, unpredictable, and crackling with a chaotic electric energy. He possessed a soaring, flexible tenor voice that did not just hit notes, it preached. He brought the unregulated, intensely emotional fervor of the Pentecostal church directly into secular soul music. Where Cameron's voice was a plea, Wynne's voice was a demand. Cameron brought his cousin to the group and vouched for his talent. The Spinners, battered, fractured, and desperate to finalize their escape from Detroit, accepted Wynne into their ranks. They essentially swapped a baritone grounded in Southern grit for a tenor flying on gospel adrenaline. In 1972, they officially signed their contracts with Atlantic Records. They stepped out of the Hitsville doors for the final time. They left behind the brooms, the packing tape, the shipping manifests, and a decade of corporate disrespect. They believed the war was over. They believed they had successfully defeated the crushing weight of the music industry's class system. They were heading to the Sigma Sound Studios in Philadelphia, where they would finally be treated not as manual laborers, but as artists. They were about to step into the recording booth with Tom Bell and create a string of consecutive million-selling masterpieces that would permanently alter the landscape of American R&B. They were about to achieve a level of fame and wealth that would make the Motown executives realize the catastrophic scale of their miscalculation. They thought they had escaped the machine, but the harsh, objective reality of the entertainment business is that escaping one factory rarely leads to freedom. It usually just means you have been acquired by a larger, more efficient machine. The Spinners had successfully shaken off their status as corporate janitors. They were about to trade the quiet humiliation of the basement for the physical destruction of the arena. The transition from West Grand Boulevard in Detroit to North 12th Street in Philadelphia was not merely a geographic relocation. It was a psychological rescue mission. When the Spinners walked into Sigma Sound Studios in 1972, they were carrying a decade of institutional trauma. They were men conditioned to apologize for their own presence. They fully expected to be handed a new set of rules, a new set of chores, and a new executive who would remind them of their expendable nature. Instead, they met Tom Bell. Tom Bell was the chief architect of the Philadelphia soul sound. He was a classically trained pianist and a brilliant arranger who did not view artists as raw material to be hammered into shape on an assembly line. He viewed them as complex instruments. When Bell looked at Henry Fambrough, Purvis Jackson, Billy Henderson, and Bobby Smith, he did not see aging background singers or disgruntled Motown cast-offs. He saw a Stradivarius. He immediately recognized the breathtaking precision of their harmonies, a vocal blend that had been completely ignored by the executives in Detroit. The issue here is not just that Bell gave them better songs. The issue is how he fundamentally restored their human dignity. For the first time in their professional lives, they were not handed a pre-recorded track and told to sing exactly what was written on the sheet music. Bell sat down with them at the piano. He asked for their input. He asked them what keys felt most comfortable for their aging voices. He asked them how they wanted to phrase the harmonies. The cognitive shock of this moment is profound. Men who had been fired from sweeping floors were suddenly being treated as co-architects of their own sound. Bell stripped away the heavy, driving, four-on-the-floor Motown beat and replaced it with lush, sweeping orchestrations. He brought in French horns, strings, and complex jazz chord progressions, creating a sophisticated sonic bed that finally matched the elegance of their voices. But the true alchemy of this new era was the integration of Philippe Wynne. Wynne was the wild card. He was the element of chaos introduced into a room full of meticulously disciplined singers. Motown's rigid charm school would have suffocated a man like Wynne within a week. He did not care about pristine pop sensibilities. He was raised in the fervent, sweat-drenched environment of the Pentecostal church. When he grabbed a microphone, he did not merely recite lyrics. He delivered a sermon. He improvised. He scatted. He pushed his voice to the very edge of breaking, channeling a raw, unvarnished emotional desperation that you simply cannot teach in an artist development class. The contrast was brilliant. You had the flawless, velvety backdrop of the original members, moving with the synchronized precision of a Swiss watch. And out in front, you had Philippe Wynne, operating like a live wire sparking on wet pavement. The recording sessions yielded immediate, undeniable results. Atlantic Records released their first single under the new partnership. But the plot twist here is that the label initially pushed the wrong song. They heavily promoted a track called How Could I Let You Get Away as the A-side. It was a solid record, but the radio disc jockeys across the country, the men who actually dictated the taste of the American public, flipped the vinyl over. They played the B-side. That B-side was I'll Be Around. The song was a masterpiece of restraint and longing. Bobby Smith took the primary lead, delivering a smooth, melancholic vocal, while the rest of the group provided a haunting, echoing harmony. It was sophisticated, it was heartbreaking, and it was completely irresistible. I'll Be Around exploded onto the airwaves. It shot to number 1 on the R&B charts and number 3 on the Billboard pop charts. It sold over 1 million copies almost instantly. The Spinners followed it with an astonishing string of massive culture-defining hits. Could It Be I'm Falling in Love, One of a Kind, Love Affair, Mighty Love? Then Came You, a duet with Dionne Warwick that secured them their first number 1 hit on the Billboard Hot 100. Finally, there was The Rubber Band Man, a sprawling, funk-driven epic that cemented their status as the undisputed kings of 1970s soul music. This was the ultimate, irrefutable vindication. The men who had been treated as excess inventory, the men who had scrubbed the toilets at Hitsville, were now generating millions of dollars. They were outselling the very Motown Class A artists they used to serve. They traded their sweat-stained mailroom shirts for spectacular custom-designed sequined suits. They bought the large houses. They secured their families' futures. They looked back at the Detroit Hit Factory from the absolute pinnacle of the music industry. They had beaten the system. They had survived the class humiliation, held on to their talent, and forced the world to recognize their worth. But this is where the reality of the music business reveals its most terrifying truth. Escaping a rigid class system does not mean you have escaped capitalism. It merely means you have been promoted to a more lucrative and far more physically destructive form of exploitation. They had escaped Motown's rigid hierarchy, but their massive success brought a different kind of toll. They were now fueling a relentless touring machine that demanded absolute physical exhaustion. In the 1970s, the economic model of the recording industry was remarkably straightforward. Records were sold to generate mainstream popularity, but the true massive cash flow, the money that kept the labels, the managers, and the promoters incredibly wealthy, was generated on the road. A hit record was merely a commercial for the concert ticket. And because the Spinners were now Atlantic Records' most reliable hit makers, the corporate machine demanded maximum extraction. The group was thrown into a touring schedule that defies modern comprehension. They were booked to perform up to 300 days a year. This was no victory lap. It was a relentless physical grind. They traveled constantly, moving from city to city, airport to airport, living out of suitcases and sleeping in unfamiliar hotel beds. They ate poor quality food at odd hours. The glamorous sequined suits they wore on stage were heavy, hot, and soaked in sweat within the first 10 minutes of the performance. And they were forced to do this night after night, week after week, with virtually no time for their bodies or their vocal cords to recover. The system treats the artists not as human beings with physiological limits, but as heavy machinery. You run the machine at maximum capacity until it breaks, because every night the machine sits idle is a night you are losing money. While the grueling schedule took a heavy toll on the older, original members of the group, the true, devastating weight of this corporate demand fell squarely onto the shoulders of Philippe Wynne. In the architecture of a 1970s R&B vocal group, the background singers provide the foundation. They execute the intricate choreography, they maintain the harmonies, and they project an image of effortless cool. They can, to a certain extent, pace themselves, but the lead singer cannot. The front man is the focal point of the audience's attention. He is the engine of the spectacle. Philippe Wynne was not hired to stand still. The audiences who bought tickets did not just want to hear the flawless vocals of the records, they demanded the manic Pentecostal energy that Wynne projected. They wanted to see him sweat. They wanted to see him bleed for the music. And Wynne, driven by an intense, almost pathological desire to please the crowd, gave them exactly what they demanded. His performances were feats of extreme physical endurance. He would leap across the stage, spin rapidly, and drop heavily to his knees to emphasize the emotional climax of a song. He would grab the microphone stand and drag it across the floor, improvising complex vocal runs, pushing his tenor voice to the very limits of its range, shouting and pleading with the audience until his throat was raw. He was doing this for 2 hours a night, nearly 300 nights a year. The human body is fundamentally not designed to sustain this level of physical and vocal trauma. The knees begin to deteriorate from the constant impact on hard wooden stages. The vocal cords become inflamed, developing nodes and calluses from being pushed past their natural breaking point without rest. The adrenaline spikes required to perform at that intensity every night severely disrupt the nervous system, leading to chronic insomnia, anxiety, and profound bone-deep exhaustion. This is the new mechanism of exploitation. It is no longer about forcing a singer to sweep a floor to demean his spirit. It is about forcing him to sing until his physical biology begins to collapse, simply because the ticket sales demand it. Wynne was trapped in a terrifying paradox. He was the most vital component of a multi-million-dollar touring enterprise, yet he had absolutely no control over the pace of his own life. The promoters booked the dates, the management approved the routing, and the label demanded the revenue. Wynne was merely expected to show up, put on the heavy suit, and detonate on stage. His fatal weakness shifted. At Motown, the group's hamartia was misplaced loyalty to a corporation. Now Wynne's hamartia was his misplaced loyalty to the audience. He believed that he owed them his physical destruction. He believed that if he stopped giving them 110% of his energy, the magic would disappear, the hits would stop, and he would be cast back out into the obscurity from which G.C. Cameron had rescued him. He was terrified of losing the crown he had just acquired, so he tried to carry the weight of the entire touring apparatus on his own back. But the friction was becoming unbearable. The grueling schedule was not just destroying Wynne's body, it was fracturing the internal dynamics of the group. The spinners were seasoned veterans who understood the necessity of pacing. They knew how to navigate the road. Wynne was a volatile energy source burning itself out. The dressing rooms, once places of triumphant celebration, became tense and quiet. The exhaustion bred paranoia and resentment. Wynne began to feel that he was doing all the heavy lifting while the other members simply stood behind him and collected the equal share of the profits. He was losing his grip on reality, heavily insulated by the artificial environment of the road, surrounded by people whose salaries depended entirely on his ability to keep singing. No one was telling him to stop. No one was telling him to rest. The system does not possess a conscience. It only possesses an accounting department. By the time 1977 arrived, the situation had reached a critical mass. Philippe Wynne was physically ravaged. His voice, once a soaring instrument of limitless power, was showing signs of severe strain. His mental state was deteriorating under the relentless pressure to perform. He felt alienated from the very group that had brought him to the pinnacle of global stardom. He looked around the massive arenas they were selling out, and he realized a chilling truth. He had escaped the Motown factory, only to become the prime workhorse in the Atlantic touring mine. He was generating wealth for everyone around him, but he was paying for it with his own life expectancy. Desperate to reclaim agency over his own body, his own art, and his own schedule, Wynne made a unilateral and devastating decision. He decided he no longer needed the machine. He believed his voice was the sole currency required to maintain his massive success. He convinced himself that if he stepped away from the spinners, he could dictate his own terms, record his own music, and tour at a pace that would not kill him. He walked into a room with the men who had embraced him when he was a nobody, the men who had built the harmonious foundation upon which he had stood, and he told them he was leaving. Philippe Wynne officially quit the Spinners. He stepped out of the group, leaving behind the infrastructure, the management, and the unstoppable momentum they had built together. He walked out into the blinding light of a solo career, completely unaware that the industry he was trying to master had already extracted the best years of his life and was preparing to discard him with the exact same cold efficiency that Motown had used a decade earlier. The entertainment industry possesses zero memory and even less mercy. It operates on a ruthless algorithm of present tense profitability. It does not care how many millions of records you sold yesterday. It only cares what you can monetize tomorrow. When Philippe Wynne officially severed his ties with the Spinners in 1977, he operated under the profound delusion that his past achievements would serve as armor in his solo career. He believed that the industry respected his voice. He was tragically mistaken. The industry did not respect his voice. It respected the financial infrastructure that his voice helped to power. Once he stepped outside the protective shell of the Atlantic Records hit-making machine, the ecosystem that had sustained him vanished entirely. Wynne stepped into the void at the precise moment the tectonic plates of American pop music were shifting violently. The year was 1977. The sophisticated, sweeping orchestral soul of Philadelphia, the sound that Tom Bell had perfected and that Wynne had ridden to global superstardom, was being rapidly, systematically eradicated from the airwaves. It was being replaced by the relentless, synthesized, 120 beats per minute thud of disco. The market no longer demanded a frontman who could preach like a Pentecostal minister and wring every ounce of agonizing emotion from a lyric. The market demanded a steady groove that people could dance to in nightclubs. The human element of R&B was being actively downsized in favor of the mechanical drum machine. Wynne secured a solo deal with Cotillion Records, a subsidiary label under the Atlantic umbrella. He released his debut solo album, Starting All Over. The title was painfully prophetic. He was entirely stripped of the lush 5-part harmonies that had historically anchored his chaotic energy. Without Henry Fambro, Billy Henderson, Purvis Jackson, and Bobby Smith standing behind him, Wynne's frantic improvisational style suddenly sounded untethered. The album was released to the public, and the response from the industry was deafening silence. Radio programmers, the gatekeepers of the American hit machine, ignored it. It failed to chart significantly. This is where the brutal underlying mathematics of the music business come into sharp focus. The issue is not merely that Wynne suffered a commercial flop. The issue is how the economic structure of a recording contract is engineered to ensure that an artist like Wynne has absolutely no financial safety net when they fall. The rapid financial deterioration of a man who was, just months prior, one of the biggest stars in the world, was entirely orchestrated by a predatory industry mechanism, recoupment. When the Spinners were generating millions of dollars for Atlantic Records, the public assumed the group was keeping the majority of that wealth. The reality of the ledger is far darker. The label advances the money for studio time, the session musicians, the orchestral arrangements, the custom sequined wardrobes, the tour buses, and the promotional campaigns. But that money is not a gift. It is a high-interest loan. Every single expense is charged back against the artist's royalty rate, which is typically a fraction of a penny per record sold. Furthermore, Wynne did not write the massive hits that made him famous. He did not write The Rubber Band Man or Could It Be I'm Falling in Love. He was an interpreter. In the music industry, the songwriters and the publishers get paid while they sleep. The singer only gets paid when he is physically standing on a stage, sweating under the stage lights. When Wynne quit the Spinners, he instantly severed his only actual pipeline of liquid cash, the grueling 300-day-a-year touring schedule. Because his solo album failed to generate revenue, there was no tour support from the label. The massive arena bookings evaporated overnight. The royalty checks from his Spinners days, heavily diluted by the label's recoupment accounting and split among the other members, were not enough to sustain the lifestyle of a superstar. Within a staggeringly short period, the financial walls began to close in. The system is perfectly designed to extract generational wealth from black artists while leaving them legally responsible for the operational costs of their own exploitation. Desperate to maintain relevance and generate income, Wynne found a temporary, chaotic lifeboat. He crossed paths with George Clinton, the brilliant and eccentric mastermind behind the Parliament Funkadelic Collective. Clinton recognized the raw, unregulated power of Wynne's voice and invited him to join the P-Funk touring mob. It was a bizarre, fascinating collision of two entirely different musical universes. Wynne traded the meticulously choreographed, tuxedo-clad discipline of the Spinners for the sprawling, anarchic circus of the Mothership Connection. This partnership yielded one of the most culturally significant moments of Wynne's post-Spinners career. In 1979, Funkadelic released the epic track, Not Just Knee Deep. If you listen to the extended version of that record, it is Philippe Wynne providing the frantic, legendary scat singing and vocal improvisation that drives the song to its climax. He proved, unequivocally, that his vocal instrument was still razor sharp. But there is a deep, dramatic contradiction in this alliance. Wynne had quit the Spinners because he wanted absolute control over his own career. He wanted to be the undisputed boss. Instead, he found himself functioning as a featured guest, a hired gun, in a collective that was exponentially larger and more uncontrollable than the group he had left. He was not the focal point. He was merely one of a dozen moving parts in George Clinton's massive stage show. The P-Funk tours were notorious for their grueling length and chaotic financial management. It was not a sustainable environment for a man in his late 30s who was already showing signs of severe physical and mental exhaustion. By the early 1980s, the lifeboat began to sink. Parliament Funkadelic collapsed under the weight of its own legal and financial disputes. The music industry completed its transition away from 1970s organic soul. The MTV era arrived, dominated by highly visual, synthesizer-driven pop acts like Michael Jackson and Prince. Wynne was suddenly viewed by label executives as a relic, an artifact from a bygone era that no longer held commercial viability. He was dropped by his major label distributors. He spent the early 1980s frantically searching for a home, eventually signing a brief mismatched deal with Sugar Hill Records, a label primarily known for pioneering early hip-hop. The pairing made no sense and it generated no hits. The descent into obscurity is not a sudden drop. It is a slow, agonizing slide down a staircase of compromises. When the major labels stop returning your phone calls, you have to bypass the corporate structure and go directly to the consumer to survive. You have to return to the road, but without a hit record to drive ticket sales, the venues shrink rapidly. You are no longer booking the 20,000-seat Madison Square Garden. You are booking 2,000-seat municipal auditoriums. Then you are booking 500-seat supper clubs. Then ultimately you are booking local nightclubs on the outskirts of major cities. This is the ultimate grueling reality of the Chitlin circuit for aging R&B stars. You are no longer traveling with a massive entourage, a horn section, and a dedicated sound engineer. You are often traveling alone or with a skeleton crew. You arrive in a city and you are forced to perform with a local pickup band that you met 3 hours before the show. You hand out sheet music to musicians who have not rehearsed your material, and you pray they can follow your tempo. You are singing in venues with terrible acoustics, blown-out monitors, and audiences who are often more interested in buying drinks than listening to the performance. The psychological devastation of this routine is absolute. You are forced to introduce yourself to people who used to scream your name. You must stand on small, sticky wooden stages and sing The Rubber Band Man, attempting to summon the explosive energy of your youth while looking out at a crowd of 200 people. Every single night is a visceral, inescapable reminder of the altitude from which you have fallen. This slow descent culminated on July 13, 1984. The location is Oakland, California. The venue is a small, unremarkable establishment called Ivy's Nightclub. It is a Friday night. There are no television cameras. There are no custom-tailored suits. There is no major label executive sitting in the VIP section. There is just a small, crowded room of patrons who paid a modest cover charge to see a man who used to be the king of Philadelphia soul. Philippe Wynne is 43 years old. Chronologically, he is a man in the middle of his life. Biologically, his body has been aged decades beyond that number. His cardiovascular system carries the accumulated damage of a lifetime spent inside the industry's meat grinder. It carries the stress of the Motown mailroom, where his self-worth was systematically dismantled. It carries the physical trauma of the Atlantic Arena tours, where he was forced to perform athletic feats for 300 days a year without adequate recovery. It carries the crippling anxiety of the solo years, the unpaid tax bills, the plummeting record sales, and the daily humiliation of hustling for nightclub gigs to make payroll. He steps onto the small stage at Ivy's. He takes the microphone. The house band strikes up the music. Wynne does what he has been conditioned to do his entire adult life. He ignores his own physical limitations to satisfy the paying customer. He begins to sing. He pushes his tenor voice, reaching for the soaring gospel-infused high notes that defined his legacy. He attempts to deliver the spectacle, but the human machine finally reaches its absolute limit. The heart muscle, starved of oxygen and overwhelmed by years of chronic hypertension and stress, fails. The electrical signals in his chest misfire catastrophically. Right in the middle of a song, Wynne stops singing. He grabs his chest, his knees buckle, and he collapses heavily onto the floor of the stage. What happened next remains one of the most chilling moments in live entertainment history. The audience does not immediately rush to his aid. The audience cheers. They clap their hands, they whistle. They believe this is part of the show. They have been conditioned by years of consuming R&B performances to expect high melodrama. They have watched James Brown drop to his knees in mock exhaustion, only to have a cape thrown over his shoulders before springing back to life. They have watched Jackie Wilson perform acrobatic feats of staged agony. The audience at IV's assumes that Philippe Wynne is simply acting out the extreme emotional devastation of the lyrics. They are actively consuming his actual biological death as a piece of theatrical entertainment. It takes several agonizing minutes for the band and then the crowd to realize that the man on the floor is not acting. The applause slowly dies out, replaced by panic. The club management calls for an ambulance. Paramedics arrive, push through the confused patrons, and load Wynne onto a stretcher. He's rushed to a local Oakland hospital. The medical intervention is futile. The massive myocardial infarction has caused irreversible damage. Philippe Wynne never regains consciousness. He is pronounced dead early the next morning on July 14th, 1984. The news of his death ripples through the music industry, but it does not stop the machinery. The Atlantic Records corporate entity continues to operate seamlessly. By the time Wynne died on that nightclub floor, the Spinners had already completely moved on. When Wynne originally quit in 1977, the label simply ordered the management to find a replacement part for the engine. They hired a spectacular vocalist named John Edwards. With Edwards at the helm, the Spinners went right back into the studio, recorded the massive hit, Working My Way Back to You, and returned to the arenas. The industry proved its cold efficiency. The death of one frontman does not halt the production line. The group continued to tour for decades, transitioning smoothly into the lucrative oldies and nostalgia circuits, performing the very songs that Wynne had bled to make famous. The legacy of the Spinners exposes the brutal reality of the American music business. The catalog of music created by the Spinners is monumental. Their intricate harmonies and soaring melodies are permanently embedded in the cultural fabric of the world. They provided the soundtrack to millions of weddings, parties, and moments of genuine human joy. But the creation of that joy required a profound human sacrifice. The story of the Spinners and Philippe Wynne is not a triumphant tale of talent conquering adversity. It is a harsh record of an industry that extracts every ounce of value from its artists. It begins with the class humiliation of Hitsville, U.S.A., where generational vocalists were forced to sweep floors and pack boxes to justify a $50 paycheck, their loyalty weaponized against their own advancement. It moves to the legal captivity of G.C. Cameron, proving that a corporation will gladly fracture a brotherhood to protect a contractual asset. It peaks with the illusion of freedom at Atlantic Records, where the artists simply traded the psychological degradation of the mailroom for the physical destruction of the touring arena, acting as indentured assets to a 300-day-a-year schedule. And it concludes on the sticky floor of a nightclub in Oakland, California, where a man who generated millions of dollars for white executives died while trying to sing for his supper, while the audience applauded his demise. Their music is a testament to the indestructible nature of black artistry. Their lives are a testament to the ruthless, grinding machinery of an industry that measures human worth entirely by the capacity to generate a hit record and discards the human being the exact moment that capacity runs dry.